Want to add enterprise-grade Scalekit Authentication to your FastMCP server with just 3 required parameters and automatic JWT validation. We'll configure the ScalekitProvider to handle OAuth endpoint discovery through your environment URL, validate tokens against your server's base URL, and enforce scope requirements, all while showing how to implement this both through explicit code and environment variables. You'll see how to create a protected server that automatically verifies RS-256 signed tokens, checks issuer and audience claims, and exposes an authentication status tool to confirm everything works. From FastMCP, import FastMCP. From FastMCP server, auth, providers, Scalekit import ScalekitProvider. Hash discovers Scalekit endpoints and set up JWT token validation. Auth provider equals ScalekitProvider. Environment URL equals Scalekit environment URL. Hash Scalekit environment URL. Resource ID equals Scalekit resource ID. Hash resource server ID. Base URL equals server URL. Hash public MCP endpoint. Required scopes equals read. Hash optional scope enforcement. Hash create FastMCP server with auth. MCP equals FastMCP. Name equals my Scalekit protected server. Auth equals auth provider. At MCP, tool. Def auth status, dict. Show Scalekit authentication status. Hash extract user claims from the JWT. Return. Message. This tool requires authentication via Scalekit. Authenticated, true. Provider, Scalekit. This demonstrates the remote OAuth pattern, where Scalekit serves as the centralized authentication authority, while FastMCP handles local JWT validation, creating a clean separation between identity management and service authorization. The pattern uses Scalekit's environment URL for automatic OAuth endpoint discovery and validates tokens against strict criteria: RS-256 signatures, issuer matching, audience validation using your server's base URL, and scope enforcement. What makes this distinctive is how it combines automatic configuration with rigorous security checks while requiring minimal implementation code. The implementation works through declarative configuration, where you specify either code parameters or environment variables that define the trust relationship. The ScalekitProvider uses the environment URL to locate OAuth endpoints, the resource ID to verify token audience claims, and your server's base URL to prevent token replay across environments. When a request arrives, FastMCP automatically validates the JWT against these parameters before executing any tool functions, with optional scope enforcement adding another layer of access control. Configuration remains flexible through either explicit constructor arguments or environment variables using the FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider prefix. This approach matters because it provides enterprise-grade security with minimal development overhead, handling complex OAuth flows and token validation automatically. You gain SSO compatibility with SAML, OIDC, and major identity providers while maintaining strict audience validation that prevents token misuse. The trade-off is operational dependency on Scalekit's availability and the requirement for HTTPS in production. But this is justified by automatic key rotation, built-in scope enforcement, and elimination of custom authentication code. The pattern excels in microservices and AI tooling, where you need verified identity without managing credentials or session state. Let's break it down line by line. From FastMCP, import FastMCP. This imports FastMCP, the core framework for building AI-callable tool servers with built-in authentication. It handles tool registration, open API schema generation from type hints, and manages the secure protocol between AI models and your Python functions. The framework supports enterprise authentication through providers like Scalekit, where the provider handles both OAuth endpoint discovery and JWT validation. Configuration can be explicit in code or environment-driven using variables like FastMCP server auth, with the full class path and FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider prefix settings.
From FastMCP server auth providers, Scalekit imports ScalekitProvider.
This imports ScalekitProvider, FastMCP's built-in OAuth 2 OIDC authentication handler that integrates with Scalekit's identity platform. It handles both OAuth endpoint discovery via environment URL and JWT validation using resourced plus your server's public URL. The provider enforces RS-256 signed JWT validation with issuer, audience, using base URL and expiry checks, while supporting scope enforcement through required scopes. For environment-based configuration, use variables prefixed with FastMCP auth ScalekitProvider. Note that base URL in code corresponds to MCP URL in environment variables, and HTTPS is mandatory in production.
Hash discovers Scalekit endpoints and set up JWT token validation. Auth provider equals ScalekitProvider.
Initializes Scalekit's OAuth 2.1 provider with automatic endpoint discovery and JWT validation. The environment URL parameter enables dynamic OAuth configuration discovery, while resourced and base URL, called MCP URL in environment variables, configure secure token validation, ensuring audience claims match your server's public URL to prevent replay attacks. This provider enforces RS-256 signed JWT validation with mandatory issuer, audience, and expiry checks, supporting enterprise SSO via SAML-OIDC. Configuration can be explicit, as shown, or via environment variables prefixed with FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider, with HTTPS required in production.
Environment URL equals Scalekit environment URL. Hash Scalekit environment URL.
Specifies Scalekit's OAuth 2.1 issuer URL, enabling automatic discovery of all required endpoints, authorization, token, and JWKS. This URL, combined with resourced and base URL, forms the foundation for JWT validation, where Scalekit issues tokens and FastMCP enforces RS-256 signature verification, issuer matching, audience validation against base URL, and expiry checks. In production, this must be an HTTPS endpoint, and the same configuration can be achieved via FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider environment URL, environment variable.
Resource ID equals Scalekit resource ID. Hash resource server ID.
Specifies the Scalekit resource server identifier that must exactly match your MCP server registration in Scalekit's dashboard. This parameter enables strict JWT audience validation, ensuring tokens can only be used with this specific server instance by comparing against the base URL parameter. The audience claim validation prevents token replay attacks across different services.
Base URL equals server URL. Hash public MCP endpoint.
This sets the public MCP server URL that Scalekit uses for strict JWT audience validation. The value must exactly match your server's public endpoint and the MCP URL environment variable, with HTTPS enforced in production. This prevents token replay attacks by ensuring JWTs are only valid for this specific service instance.
Required scopes equals read. Hash optional scope enforcement.
Enforces OAuth 2 scope validation by requiring the read scope in the JWT scope claim. Scalekit validates this during token verification by checking the scope claim against this list, automatically rejecting requests without required permissions. The audience claim is validated against the base URL parameter to prevent token replay attacks between different server instances. This closing parenthesis finalizes the ScalekitProvider configuration, completing the OAuth 2.1 setup for JWT validation. The provider uses environment URL to discover Scalekit's OAuth endpoints, validates tokens against resourced as the required audience claim, and enforces RS-256 signatures while checking issuer, audience, base URL, and expiry. All parameters can alternatively be set via environment variables prefixed with FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider. For production, HTTPS is mandatory, and the pattern implements remote OAuth with enterprise SSO support while exposing token claims for debugging via the auth status tool.
Create FastMCP server with auth. MCP equals FastMCP. Name equals my Scalekit protected server. Auth equals auth provider.
Initializes the FastMCP server with Scalekit Authentication by binding the pre-configured auth provider. This creates an OAuth 2.1 protected endpoint where Scalekit handles token issuance while FastMCP validates incoming RS-256 signed JWTs, checking issuer, audience, using base URL, and expiry claims. The base URL parameter, called MCP URL in environment variables, prevents token replay attacks by ensuring tokens are scoped to this specific server. For environment-based configuration, use FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider prefixed variables, with HTTPS mandatory in production.
At MCP, tool. Def auth status, dict. Show Scalekit authentication status.
The @MCP tool decorator registers this function as an AA-accessible endpoint, with FastMCP auto-generating the tool schema from the type hint and docstring. This pattern creates a protected route that only authenticated clients can call, with Scalekit handling OAuth flows and FastMCP enforcing JWT validation. ScalekitProvider combines OAuth endpoint discovery via environment URL with strict JWT validation using resourced and base URL, called MCP URL in environment variables. The provider verifies RS-256 signed tokens, checks the odd claim against your server's URL to prevent replay attacks, and validates scope requirements before allowing access. Configuration can use explicit parameters as shown, or environment variables with the FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider prefix.
Extract user claims from the JWT. Return.
This comment marks where you'd access verified JWT claims after Scalekit's validation. The provider handles both OAuth endpoint discovery via environment URL and JWT validation using resourced and base URL parameters. For environment-based configuration, use variables prefixed with FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider, like FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider environment URL. The provider enforces HTTPS in production and validates audience claims against base URL to prevent token replay attacks. All configuration supports both explicit code parameters and environment variables.
Message. This tool requires authentication via Scalekit.
This message explicitly declares the authentication requirement to API consumers. It serves as both machine-readable documentation and a user-facing confirmation that Scalekit's OAuth flow successfully completed before tool execution. The hard-coded response demonstrates the expected structure, while actual validation occurs in the Scalekit provider's JWT verification layer.
Authenticated, true.
This hard-coded true value simulates a successful Scalekit JWT validation response. In production, FastMCP's ScalekitProvider automatically verifies the token's RS-256 signature, issuer claim, audience claim against your base URL, and expiry time. The actual implementation would dynamically return this structure after validating the token's claims, with authenticated reflecting the real verification result.
Provider, Scalekit.
This field explicitly declares Scalekit as the authentication provider in the response payload. It confirms the JWT was validated against Scalekit's OAuth 2.1 service using the configured resourced and base URL, or MCP URL in environment variables, with the environment URL parameter handling automatic endpoint discovery. The static value lets clients verify the auth source matches Scalekit's MCP server registration, while the underlying provider enforces RS-256 signed JWT validation with issuer, audience, using base URL, and expiry checks, all configurable via environment variables prefixed with FastMCP server auth ScalekitProvider. HTTPS is mandatory in production. This closing brace completes the auth status tool function, which serves as a verification endpoint for Scalekit authentication. The function demonstrates successful JWT validation by returning a hard-coded response with authentication metadata, proving the Scalekit provider correctly processes tokens before any real claim inspection. The response structure matches the declared dict return type hint, showing the required provider information while confirming the auth pipeline works. This pattern is useful for testing authentication flows without exposing real user data. Scalekit FastMCP Authentication. The ScalekitProvider bridges OAuth 2.1 discovery with JWT validation, using your environment URL to locate endpoints, while enforcing RS-256 signed token verification against issuer and audience claims. The base URL parameter, called MCP URL in environment variables, serves as both the public endpoint and JWT audience claim for replay protection. You've implemented an authentication layer where Scalekit issues tokens and FastMCP validates them, all while keeping your tool definitions unchanged.
The endpoint that never sees a password becomes the gatekeeper of all access.